Good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Susan Mundry, and I am the co-lead of the Teacher Preparation and Research Alliance at the Regional Education Laboratory, Northeast Islands, that is sponsoring today's event. The workshop, Using Data to Promote Culturally Responsive Teaching, is session one of a two-session workshop that is focused on bringing together the concepts and ideas of promoting data literacy among teachers with the concepts and ideas of promoting culturally responsive teaching. I'm delighted to introduce today two of my colleagues, Dr. Ellen Mandinach and Dr. Saroja Awana, who will introduce themselves. Ellen?
Hi, I'm Ellen Mandinach. I am from the regional lab and live in Scottsdale, Arizona, where it's gorgeous today. Hope it's good where you are. It's a privilege to work with all of you on this important topic. I come from the perspective of data literacy and what that means for teachers in particular, but across the board, and more recently of how teacher preparation programs can begin to integrate this concept or these new concepts merged together into their curricula as a way of better preparing teacher candidates before they go out into their real practice. Saroja?
Hi, everyone. This is Saroja Awana. Ellen, Susan, thank you for inviting me to be a part, I think, of this very important workshop, but more broadly, this important work that we're advancing through this series, and that is culturally responsive data literacy. I am a passionate believer in the power of culturally responsive teaching and leading to advance educational equity for students. And culturally responsive teaching and its connection to data literacy, I don't think has gotten enough attention, or maybe even like people have thought about it. I don't think it's on people's radar. So this has just been a great opportunity in working with Ellen and my colleagues to think about the intersection of these two concepts that haven't met. I think it's a great marriage, and we're really looking forward to working with all of you to talk more and to learn more together about how we can be culturally responsive in relation to our understandings and use of data to support student learning.
Thank you, Saroja. And Saroja, would you walk us through today's agenda?
Yes, sorry about that. The agenda on your screen, what we hope to accomplish in this less than 90 minutes now time together, we've gone through our welcome and introductions. We're going to shortly walk you through the objectives for the workshop. Then my colleague Ellen and I will give an overview of these two big concepts that we just laid out, data literacy and culturally responsive practice, as a way to introduce this idea of culturally responsive data literacy. We're going to do a role play with you by way of sort of thinking about what culturally responsive data literacy sort of looks like, sounds like, through the conversations between a mentor and a candidate, and then give you an opportunity to look at some scenarios and sort of practice some questioning and thinking about how to provoke your candidates to think about culturally responsive data literacy. And then we'll close with a preview of workshop number 2 and some homework for you all to do in preparation for that, as well as some closing remarks.
Okay, so as Saroja said, we really want to get you engaged. The big thing that we want to accomplish in session 1 is first to give you an awareness and an understanding of what this concept of the merger of data literacy and culturally responsive practice is, provide you an opportunity to get your hands wet with some interactive activities that include some polls, some chats, and a scenario. And then have you go back to your institution, work with your colleagues, think about where this concept, construct might be integrated into your own institution, into the landscape of your courses. Then come back for our second session, a time to be determined sometime in late winter, early spring, and have a much more deeper dive into the integration, what your plans might be, and how we might help you to accomplish that task. For some reason, it is not advancing properly. Okay, there we go. Yeah. So we basically laid out our overarching goal, your understanding of what this concept is, why it's important, what you can do as teacher preparation programs. I also noticed that there are some school district people, some state departments of education. You all have an important role to play in building awareness, building capacity around culturally responsive data literacy. My advancing is not working properly, Jenny. Okay. So, 3 goals overarching for today. Understanding the skills, knowledge, and dispositions that even go beyond data literacy and culturally responsive practices. Understanding the importance of why we've merged these to address equity issues, diversity, the whole child, and to build an understanding about what is called the asset model, which is in direct contrast to what's known as the deficit model, which has heretofore linked data use with the accountability movement and the deficit. So remediating a problem of practice, identifying a problem for which data can be addressing. So we're going to go to our first poll here. Does your program explicitly teach data literacy? We would like you to answer either yes or no, and let us hear from you about what you're doing. So far, okay. Keep on going, folks. Okay, so just as a quick blush for those who have responded and urge others to come in on this, it's vastly a no. Data literacy is not an explicit part of your curriculum. And that's an important thing to keep in mind as we go through today. Jenny's still having problems with the advancing, so maybe somebody wants to take that over. I am not advancing.
Ellen, you've advanced.
Okay. Okay. So let's think about a second question, and this we would like you to discuss through the chat on your pod. We would like to hear from you about how you would define culturally responsive data literacy before we get into the weeds of doing that. So if you take a few seconds, and please let us know what you think, and Susan will monitor your responses. Are we getting people in the chat?
Are typing.
Okay, I see at least one person is. We really want to hear from you because knowing what you think, and that will help us to better address your needs. So far, I'm seeing 2 good responses. Okay, I'm going to move on since, and we can discuss those. I know that Saroja is responding to some of them. Okay, so let me just give a very brief description of what data literacy for teachers is as a construct. And we talk about knowledge, skills, and dispositions of effective and responsible data use. That's sort of it in a nutshell. It's using data to analyze, examine, interpret, and understand a variety of kinds of data. And I know that one person mentioned different kinds of data in their chat. One of the important things about data literacy for teachers is that data are not just test results or student indices. They're much more than that. They can be self-efficacy, they can be affective, they can be motivation, they can be justice, they can even be transportation, health, many other sorts of kinds of data. We have I'm going to just quickly go through. There are 5 components to data literacy, and I will refer you to handout number 1. It's an inquiry cycle. It is not a continuum. It is not linear in any way, but we go from starting with identifying or framing a question to a variety of skills using data, transforming the data into information, then information into a decision. And this is where the pedagogical content knowledge is so important. What is the action that is being taken by an educator to make a decision? Then the evaluation of the outcome, and it iterates depending on what is happening. So with that, there are other components. In your handout, we fleshed out the skills, knowledge, and disposition. I urge you to take a closer look later on when you have a moment. Importance? Absolutely. Increased evidence, need for evidence-based education. It's been going on for at least 15 or more years. It's evidence, it's data, it's information, and it's knowledge. Experience of educators is absolutely critical, but relying on it is not a sufficient way to address the pressing problems that students bring to us. The field of education is, as I mentioned, moving away from a deficit notion to an asset-based notion that looks at data for continuous improvement, not just about accountability and compliance. Of course, we all have to deal with that, but it's really about continuous improvement of a student, of a class, of a school, of a district, right up the educational system. So I'll pause there. Let's see if any of you have any questions that you can place into the chat, and then I will turn it over to Saroja to talk about culturally responsive teaching.
Keep putting any questions that come up in the chat, and let's turn this over to Saroja.
Thank you, Ellen and Susan. So culturally responsive teaching, sort of the second part of what we're talking about today, is probably familiar to most folks on this call. It's an approach that challenges educators to recognize all students bring strengths into the classroom that should be leveraged to make learning experiences more relevant and effective for them, relevant to and effective for them. Sorry about that. And as many people know who are familiar with this language of culturally responsive teaching, it is work that was first codified by Gloria Ladson-Billings, and it really is about rigor and relevance. And so culturally responsive teaching, to debunk a myth, is not just about making, not that it's not important, but it's not just about making our students feel good about themselves and have positive self-identities, recognizing that that's very important, but it's also about choosing relevant curriculum materials, relevant in ways that connect to students' lives, that represent their experiences and their histories, their cultures. And so culturally responsive teaching encompasses a whole way, a sort of lens, a frame for how we think about learning and instruction in classrooms. It's how we think about cultures in schools that are going to be sort of supportive of students being successful. In relation to other myths about culturally responsive teaching, I think one that we should continue to debunk is that it is purely about students of color. Culture itself is more than race and ethnicity. I love this definition that Jackie Jordan Irvine uses for culturally responsive and culture generally. She says, culture ain't nothing but the way we do things around here. And so culture exists in many different spaces and places. And while race and ethnicity are an aspect of, how a culture is defined in a space, so too is language and geography, geographic region, and, other aspects of our identity. And so culturally responsive teaching is a sort of teaching practice that uses as an asset various cultural characteristics and experiences and perspectives of students. It also assumes that academic achievement of students from a variety of backgrounds will improve if they are taught through their own cultural and experiential filters. And so with all of that, we have another poll for you all, and we would love for you to weigh in just as you did on the poll earlier about data literacy. Does your program prepare candidates to enact culturally responsive teaching practices? I have a theory about this poll in comparison to the last poll. Yes, and my theory looks like it's proving true. And it's looking like from our poll that just about everyone participating identifies that this is part of your program and what you do in your preparation of candidates. I suspected that this would probably be more widespread than we saw with data literacy, and so I'm certainly not surprised. To go ahead and go on to our next slide. And I'm not going to talk through this so much as to just offer this. The slide deck is one of the downloads available for you today in the bottom left section of the screen. But really just to show folks and maybe even give you a crib notes when you're doing your work later on to pull from, and that is the research base for culturally responsive teaching. There is a strong and long, I would say, research base around this. I mentioned Ladson Billings' work, but certainly Geneva Gay, and more recently the work of Django Paris and his work talking about culturally sustaining teaching and pedagogy. We also have, in the last few years, the work of Zaretta Hammond that has been really powerful and informative in thinking about sort of the cognitive sciences and the brain and how the brain works and how being culturally responsive in our practice is actually cognitively triggering parts of students' brains that can support better learning.
Okay, before we do this poll, I want to make a couple other comments. I want to distinguish between data literacy and assessment literacy because the research that's been done tends to show that teacher prep programs will teach assessment rather than data literacy. So being very clear about our definition of what data are and how diverse they are much more than just test results. That's an important thing for you all to keep in mind. And why the merger also. So what we would love you to do at this point is to reflect about what Saroja just said, what I've said about data literacy, and there are some 50 some odd skills that are in the handouts that we provided to you, plus the fact that there are resources and references later on in your slide deck and handouts to refer to, those that Saroja has already mentioned and others that I'm not citing but are relevant to the data literacy. So given what you've learned so far about both data literacy and culturally responsive teaching practice, have you had any ahas about the ways you might prepare candidates for both concepts or the merger of these constructs? Please use the chat and let us hear from you. Well, I love what Allison has just said about a two-way relationship because that's a perfect segue for the next slide. One of the things that we were positing as we were preparing for this and thinking about the merger of the concepts was the possibility of this 2x2 table where you have data literacy on the x-axis and culturally responsive teaching on the y. Obviously, the goal for everyone, and considering that 100% of you said that that culturally responsive teaching is part of your, is important, it's part of what you do, everyone wants to get to this quadrant, the upper right-hand quadrant. The question I will raise at this point is the possibility that somebody could be high data literate but not culturally responsive in their practice, even though one of the main skills in high data literacy is to be able to understand the need to use diverse data sources, as well as understanding the context of the learner, using many of Lee Shulman's kinds of knowledge of content, knowledge of construct, knowledge of context, knowledge of learner characteristics, understanding of pedagogy. So think about this because we will return to this, this table later on to get some of the responses from you. So here's my question. Do you think it is possible to hit that lower quadrant? Low culturally responsive teaching, but high data literate. And try and explain in the chat your thoughts on this. We'd love to hear from you because we had a fascinating internal discussion amongst ourselves about the possibilities. And there were differences of opinion. We have some folks typing. We'd love to hear from more of you. And to stimulate some thought, and I hope I don't mess up the poll on this, but consider these propositions. Is being data literate also being culturally responsive, and vice versa? Are they mutually exclusive? Do they overlap? Do they intersect? And is having high data literacy and high culturally responsive teaching in that quadrant the ultimate aspiration? Because many of you have said that you don't teach data literacy, and there must be a reason for that, yet you all said that you do around culturally responsive practices. And I see one response about only using standardized assessments. Love to hear more from you about that. Because unfortunately, and in this frame where we're talking about data for the purpose of culturally responsive practice, what the research has shown, particularly done by Amanda Datno at UCSD, is that standardized assessments are inextricably linked to the accountability movement. It's what data give, it's what data gets a bad rep for. and it serves to further marginalize the most challenged students, which is why we want to move to the asset model, understanding a student's interests, backgrounds, their strengths, rather than talking about their weaknesses and their deficits. Hopefully I've done sufficient wait time, and we can always come back to that when we get to the final demonstration of that quadrant. So, Susan, I'll turn it back over to you about the gap analysis.
Susan, I think you're on mute.
Hi, everyone. Sorry about that. I'm glad to be back, and I think in this next chunk of the agenda, we want to introduce you to a few tools that we have identified to put into practice some of the things to move educator prep programs forward in terms of the extent to which they are reflective of culturally responsive data literacy. So what we'd like to do is share with you, if you look at handout number 2, and if you've downloaded handout number 2 from the pod, what we want to give you is a tool to really begin to think about your current practices and where, in fact, the concepts of culturally responsive data literacy, including skills, dispositions, knowledge, and practices, are actually being taught, and if they are. When we polled you, so many of you said that 100% said that you are teaching cultural proficiency, cultural responsive teaching, but many fewer were explicitly teaching data literacy. So the question may be to think about where in your current educator prep programs you are addressing culturally responsive teaching and where you could incorporate and think about culturally responsive data literacy within that. So what we've done is we've given you, created a tool called an outcomes map that we would like you to look at briefly today, but to take on as homework to think about in your courses, in the learning experiences that you provide for your candidates. Where are you addressing some of the outcomes that we're talking about today, specifically culturally responsive teaching practice and building data literacy skills? And are you, in terms of where you're teaching those courses and learning and having candidates have certain learning experiences, to in detail examine what are the signature assignments that are being given to the students and that they're engaging in that would allow them to become aware of or be introduced to the concepts that Ellen and Saroja are sharing with all of us today. But then more importantly, where in those assignments are they being not only introduced but reinforced, and our candidates given the opportunity to demonstrate and to show mastery in those signature assignments within their coursework. So we'd like to invite you as homework after this session to really dig into this, look at the outcomes map, and consider identifying and laying out the courses. And I've given some examples of where in one program I know that there's some courses and some learning experiences where students are given the opportunity to address culturally responsive teaching practice and data literacy. But what's really important is to get inside the syllabi of those courses or the descriptions of the experiences and the particular assignments that student teacher candidates are given as students to unpack where in your program are you introducing, reinforcing, and asking candidates to demonstrate and master these skills. And the idea here is that you will be able to then have a kind of a roadmap for thinking about where is it that you could do some additional work, both between this session and the next session, and to build out additional content that would be in these courses. It would be ideal to see that for culturally responsive teaching practice and data literacy, candidates have a sequence of learning opportunities for being introduced to the concepts and how to use them, and that are then reinforced, demonstrated, sort of, and mastered. So I'm going to give you just a few minutes. I know some of you are sitting with some colleagues and some of you are sitting alone, but I'd like to give you just a few minutes to look over the outcomes map. You will see that, the handout number 2, and you will see that there are some very explicit directions outlining the objective of the curriculum mapping to identify and articulate how each course in your program helps students to achieve these outcomes. Really looking at, what is culturally responsive data literacy, which is defined on the handout as the integration of culturally responsive pedagogy in which a whole child perspective, an equity lens, and an asset-based model is used to capitalize on students' backgrounds, interests, and strengths, and data literacy in which educators collect, analyze, and interpret diverse sources of data, as one of you mentioned in the chat, as a practice for culturally responsive data literacy. And that data informs the decisions about students and other educational topics. It often provokes the data user to really begin to think differently, as Ellen talked about, from a broader perspective and an asset lens about their students and about how to address education problems of practice. So the real starting point in using this map is to review the program's vision for what every candidate needs and will know and be prepared to do when they complete the program. And to unpack, as I said, the particular courses and learning experiences that you are offering and whether they cover and really fully address the full range of experiences needed for candidates to be culturally responsive and data literate across the spectrum of introduced, reinforced, demonstrated, and mastered. I'm going to give you just a couple of minutes to look at that yourselves, look it over. If you have questions or comments, please put them in the chat. And we hope that you will complete this analysis for your own program as homework. And time doesn't allow us to do it today together, but we will be available to check in between session 1 and session 2 for any questions you may have about completing this.
Going over that in such great detail. This is Saroja again, and I actually just want to, before we get into the next part of the workshop, I just wanted to also emphasize for folks that, the starting place is just, like with any work we do, it's just getting a real strong sense of the landscape, right? Oftentimes we're working in these programs. I say we because I still adjunct. I still work in a teacher prep program at the University of Maryland, and I know there were some times years ago where we really were trying to be better at what we did. We came out of a program approval or tape review, and in preparation for that, but then coming out of that, recognized there were some things we could be doing better. And so, there's so much happening across different departments and teams that just being able to sit down and as a college or school of ed, to sit down and map out what is happening, what are all the courses, thinking about that in relation to our conceptual framework for the program. All of us in our programs have this vision for what our candidates are going to look like when they come out, what they'll be able to know and do. And so mapping, what we're doing to what we think we are doing or want to be doing is like such an important first step just to see. And then, like if you look at this outcomes map, across that top row, I just plugged in some things relevant to what we're talking about, culturally responsive practice, data literacy, but then just threw some other things in there that are often, things that we want to make sure we're tracking. That is, where are the opportunities for candidates to develop pedagogical content knowledge, maybe, instructional technology use. But these two are not like discrete in these columns, right? So as you start to make your outcomes map, what you'll start to see is that, like something I'm doing in Practicum 333, it's actually accomplishing a couple of these different outcomes through the signature assignments that we're using or the clinical experience, right? And so to be also thinking about where are the opportunities to accomplish multiple outcomes, right? If you look at our model on the screen, Course 211, it's got, we've got like a code in two different buckets, right? And so thinking about that, and then in respect to what we're talking about today, really thinking later then about where are the opportunities to prepare our candidates to be data literate using a culturally responsive lens. So I just wanted to emphasize that. Okay, so I got a note we're behind. We're gonna go quicker. So next we are going to, my colleague Ellen and I are going to do a role play, a conversation between a teacher candidate and a mentor teacher. And as we are doing our role play, what we want you to think about is that inquiry cycle that Ellen had talked to you about earlier. It's also a visual in one of the handouts. Before we get into this, I also wanted to role model a little bit too, important when we're talking about culture, whether it's culturally responsive teaching on its own or as a relation to data literacy or in relation to school culture. No matter what it is, it's important to always establish some learning norms with your colleagues. These are some learning norms that our team like to use whenever we are having these conversations. And I share them with you by way, again, of the, essentially walking the talk. It's very important to have learning norms. But also, if you want to use them, feel free to just lift them off of here and use them in your own work. I'm not going to read them to you, but I'll just give you 10 seconds. Just look through them on the screen. Okay. So we're going to move into this scenario. And in this scenario, I am playing a teacher candidate. I'm a teacher candidate at an urban middle school, Martin Luther King Jr. Middle School. I teach 7th grade geography. And in my class, I have several students who have individualized education plans. And I have several students who are also not native English language speakers. I have many students in my class that are eligible for the free and reduced meals program at the school, and also who rely on public transportation to get back and forth to the school. So I share that with you by way of setting some context. In this conversation with my mentor teacher, we are going to be talking about a challenge that I've surfaced in my classroom. And that is in relation to one particular student. Her name is Leslie. And students in my class have accused Leslie of stealing food from their lunches. And I had a colleague who also saw Leslie taking items from the refrigerator in the staff lounge. And so with that information, I'm having a conversation with my mentor about what I should do about this dilemma as I framed it in my classroom. As Ellen and I are reading the role play, which is also available to you as a download, one of the documents, again, in the download pod, you can follow along with that script if you like, or just save it for later. But at the bottom of that document are also listed some questions. In addition to these 2 questions, there are a number of questions listed there to guide a debrief after this. So I wanted to clue you into that particular handout. It's handout number 3 in the pod. It's labeled handout number 3 in the pod. So as you listen to our conversation, here are 2 things to think about and listen for. What are the questions being asked during this conversation that reflect a culturally responsive data literacy lens? What are the questions that you hear? So think about the questions, listen for them. And then what examples of culturally responsive data literacy do you hear during the conversation? Okay, so with that, oh, sorry, didn't mean to do that. My colleague Ellen and I will start our role play.
And one thing that I want to say before we introduce this is that we would like to acknowledge a journal article by Atwood, Jimerson, and Holt that provided this context for this scenario, and then we played off of that. So with that, thank you to them and to Joe Jimerson who brought this to my attention. So I will begin as the mentor teacher, a new role for me. Okay, so what can you tell me about Leslie to help me understand her struggle as well as your struggle?
Well, Leslie's generally a good student. She's usually responsible and respectful, but in the last week she started acting out. Some of the students in the class have also accused her of stealing food from their lunches, and another teacher told me she saw her in the staff lounge earlier this week taking items from the refrigerator. The behavior just seems inconsistent to me, Ellen, with what I generally observe about her, and it's confusing. I don't understand what's going on with her.
Okay. So what else can you tell me about Leslie?
Well, she actually hasn't had any behavioral issues that I know about until now. She seems to get along well with her peers, although she is often quiet, I guess introverted. She's certainly not the social butterfly that her other female peers tend to be as teenagers.
Okay. So please tell me more about how you characterize her as introverted, other than just being not a social butterfly.
Well, I think of introverted as someone who doesn't talk much or engage with others unless, like, they're called upon to engage. I mean, don't get me wrong. She does interact with me, and I see her interact with her peers, but she's not the one that starts a conversation. So maybe she's shy. I don't know. That's just what I see.
Oh, I get it. But what do you see or what do you observe that gives you a surface-level understanding about what's happening with the students? Have you talked with Leslie about all of this? Or have you talked to other teachers, perhaps? Have you reached out to her parents or guardians? How would you find more information?
Oh, that's really good questions, Ellen. I have not. I'm not sure how to talk to her about any of this. I mean, after all, the students have made accusations, but I haven't actually seen her steal anything. And I am nervous about approaching her about all of it because I don't want to shut her down or push her away. And my colleague who saw her take the stuff from the fridge in the lounge, she doesn't know Leslie. She's never had her as a student. I tried a few times calling home, but I'm not getting any response.
Okay. I mean, those are all legitimate concerns. But let's first talk about why you're uncomfortable about talking to Leslie. How would you characterize your relationship with her?
Well, I actually don't know if I have a relationship, now that you say it that way. I mean, in my experiences, there are some people who are just quiet, I'm not one of those people. I was pretty social in school, and I still am as an adult. But, you know, there's just some students who tend to interact with more, right, because of their personalities. And maybe, like Leslie, you know, like I don't know, because of her personality or something, like maybe that's part of why I don't feel like I have a sort of relationship with her. She's not the type who provokes a conversation, and come to think about it, you know, beyond just saying good morning to her or have a nice day, which I do for all students in my class, I never really actually talk with her. And she doesn't ask questions during or after class.
Well, interesting you say that you're very social. I was the shy kid. I didn't like speaking out in public, so that's just a little bit of background. But I hear what you're saying. But our work with students is complex because regardless of their personalities or their learning styles, we have to reach them. It's our job. And you can't reach them if you don't establish a productive working relationship with them, a communication. It's an essential part of culturally responsive teaching. There's a misconception, I think at least, when people think about culturally responsive teaching, that it's solely about curriculum and activities and making them relevant to students' lives. Don't get me wrong here. This is important, but you cannot connect the curriculum and the content to them if you don't know them as a person. And you can't know them if you don't have a relationship built on trust with each of the students and the class as a whole. Have you given any thought to how you might be able to build a positive relationship with Leslie so you can talk to her about these concerns you have?
I never thought about that, Ellen, and you know what? You're so right. You know, like I said, I've always been social myself, and I have just been able to make friends and connect with people easily. So I always assume people who don't talk, well, that's just them. And maybe even I have biases towards people and my students who are more extroverted. I really don't know much about Leslie, and that's my fault. I've been preoccupied trying to protect her and her feelings, thinking that if I talked with her about all of this, it would hurt her. At the same time, writing off her lack of engagement with me is just her personality. I never considered this possibility, that I could actually be hurting her by not investing in our relationship. This is so helpful. I'm going to think about a plan to work on this, not just for Leslie, but generally in relation to all of my students. As I'm thinking about this now, there's actually a number of students I've kind of put in the Leslie box, that they might just be introverted and they don't want to engage with me. But to be effective, I have to get to know them, and I'm going to have to connect with them.
Absolutely right. Great. So let's now talk about thinking about developing a relationship and talking to Leslie as one strategy for addressing your challenge here. You said you were not able to reach anyone at home. What do you know about Leslie's home environment? That's a really important source of information to understand her. So, for example, with whom does she live? Are there adults at home where she lives? When she leaves for school in the morning? When she returns home? Those are all important sources of information for you to help her.
Yeah, you know what? I don't even know, and you're right. These are really good questions that I need to find answers to.
Now we're making progress. How might you get that information?
Well, I guess I can probably talk to the school counselor, right, to find out more. Come to think of it, I'm wondering now about how she gets back and forth to school. I know a lot of the students take, like, the public bus, and some of them walk. And some of them probably get picked up and dropped off. But I wonder about Leslie.
This is really good thinking. You have me also wondering, since Leslie has been stealing food, or accused of stealing food, does she receive free and or reduced lunch or meals at school?
Right. That's an interesting question. How would I find that information out, Ellen?
Really good question. I'm not sure who does in the school, we should find out, and we should find out together. It's possible that there could be something there that might help us understand what's really happening with Leslie. Perhaps her actions are not a behavior issue, but rather about Boots' insecurity, and she's trying to manage it on her own rather than trying to go to an adult. Just a possibility.
So, end scene. That is the end of our role play. By way of just sharing the conclusion that is also written in the role play script that is handout number 3 available to you, Saroja started interacting more one-on-one with Leslie to start building a relationship with her. Meanwhile, Ellen and Saroja dug deeper and found out that Leslie's family does indeed qualify for the free and reduced meals program, but never applied. With help from the school guidance counselor, they were able to reach her parents and learn that the family received other assistance but had run out of money before the month ended. Leslie was looking for ways to access food at school. Once they realized what was happening with Leslie, Ellen and Saroja began working with school social workers and identified other ways to support Leslie and other students who were facing similar situations in the school.
So let's unpack that a little bit. Thank you so much, Saroja and Ellen. And Ellen, clearly as a cooperating teacher, you are in that situation using your supervision to help to really raise the questions for your teacher candidate who's interning with you about how to think more deeply about students. And I want to ask our participants today to just use the chat to think about how did the role play address some of the following. How did it give examples of looking into root causes of behavior? How did you, where did you see that it perhaps went beyond the obvious explanation or assumption about a student? And what about it gave you some evidence that the teacher was going to be asset-driven and look for assets in the student? Just share some of your thoughts about those, or any other, questions that Ellen was asking Saroja that you believe reflected forcing her, dialoguing with her to think more from a culturally responsive, data literate point of view. I think it is, while you're typing, I think it is a good example of, as I think Jen Welsh commented earlier, that we really need to look at how to integrate and embed opportunities for raising awareness about cultural responsive practice. And those examples may be scenarios like this where you can start to build into many different student opportunities to learn examples like this. Allison's commenting that she was struck by the way the cooperating teacher in the scenario asked specific questions to help the educator understand she didn't have sufficient data. And very often, I think, particularly our beginning teachers find themselves with a lack of information about who their students are. Often they're hired, days or weeks ahead of the school year, and don't have that opportunity to fully develop, have the data they need, or the opportunity to begin to think about developing the relationship with their student. And Saroja talked about really not having that relationship with her student, and she prompted her to understand Leslie more broadly, to understand her circumstances, to understand what circumstances may have changed for her. Jen is commenting around really helping the teacher to examine more of what may be causing the behavior of that student, not to jump to stereotypes or assumptions about the student, but rather to really push our teacher candidate, Saroja, to clarify and identify actions that she can take.
Susan, let me add on to that. One of the research findings that Amanda Datnow and others have found is that when data are used for accountability and served for marginalization, what happens is that they use the data to confirm, unfortunately, some long-held assumptions rather than to use it in a disconfirmatory way. And that doesn't help to move toward culturally responsiveness and really understanding the student. So as Allison, well, as a couple of people have said in the chat, understanding the surrounding data around the child, whether it's about food insecurity or that they're stuck in transportation hell because they've got to make several public transportation changes and they can't get to school in time, whether it's that they're in a bullying situation, whether they're a military family with a deployed parent, all of those contextual sources of information as an educator are really becoming more and more imperative. Is it a child in foster care? Is a child in a homeless shelter? Those help to provide, and it also helps, well, it makes a teacher almost a social worker as much as a teacher, but they understand their children and can help to customize what they're doing with each child based on their own circumstances, context, and need.
That's a great point, Ellen. And I think we have a lot of different comments that we could dig into. Clearly, using scenarios, case studies like these are great learning tools, and it's just one that we wanted to provide and demonstrate for you. We do have a couple of other tools that we want to get to today. So keep those comments coming in the chat. We'll be trying to comment on a few of them as we go forward. And in our next sequence, we're going to look at some practice scenarios and give you a chance to do a little homework by yourself for a few minutes. So Saroja, I'm going to turn it over to you for that.
Ellen, or Susan, sorry. So in the, again, as we've been flagging in the handouts section there at the bottom left of your screen, there are two that if you haven't downloaded yet, please do, because we're going to be working with them now. That's handout number 4, the practice scenarios, and handout number 5, the CRDL guiding questions. And as Susan just mentioned, what these two tools are designed to do is, again, one, give more practice to this group, but could also be used by this group in any way you like with teacher candidates, maybe in any professional learning or PLCs that you're involved in at the schools. But there are 2 practice scenarios in handout number 4. And then in handout number 5, what you'll find is a set of guiding questions. And what I mean by that are, just as people commented and they heard Ellen probing me as the intern with all those great questions to provoke my thinking to be culturally responsive as I was thinking about, what data I should be pulling in and using. Even more questions are in this handout 5. And so it's not an exhaustive list. It's not every question you could ask, but we took a lot of sort of thought time to think about, like, what could be helpful for this group as you're starting to build your repertoire, starting to build your questions bank. One of the things that you hear people talk about all the time is you just don't know what you don't know. And I think that couldn't be more true a saying when it comes to this type of inquiry lens, this culturally responsive data literacy I think is a new terrain, a new realm for a lot of us. For some of us, it's not so new, but we could always benefit from sort of sharpening, our skill sets a little bit and getting more ideas from folks about what are the questions to be asking. It's hard to know if, some of these experiences that our kids have are not our own. And so what we want to give you a few minutes to do, we are running a little behind, so we won't be able to give you a whole 15 minutes right now, but we do want to step away from our microphones and give you an opportunity either by yourself or in your teams to take a look at these scenarios and to take a look at the questions and to sort of practice a little bit, As you analyze each scenario, ask yourself some of the questions that are in the questions bank and sort of play around and think about how that would shift your thinking about what could be the root cause of what's, happening in that scenario. So maybe we'll give you about 7 minutes here. And again, as you're doing this, if you do have some questions that come up or some ahas you're experiencing through this activity, please do comment in the chat box. We're keeping that chat box open, and we welcome you to continue to put your ideas there.
I think it looks like we're ready to move on, given the folks who just jumped right in. We hope you had a chance to review at least one of those scenarios and reflect on the questions, and also to have a chance to look at the longer handout 5 with the culturally responsive data literacy guiding questions. Again, we think we're trying to really put in front of you a couple of resources and tools that you can begin to think about using as you decide some next steps on your own work. In terms of the practice scenarios themselves, I wonder if do you have one key takeaway from your own personal reflection or your discussion if you're with a team? One key takeaway as you look at those two scenarios, either the scenario 1 or scenario 2. Imagine using these kinds of short snippets to generate ideas about the kinds of data that would be helpful for some of your candidates to start thinking about issues like root cause and actions that they can take to better serve students. Heather's commenting that her takeaway is a realization that she was neglecting the aspect of asset-based, students' assets. I think I've got that right. And I think just, again, as human beings, I think we are all prone to focus on what's really in front of us. And the more that we can help candidates to step back and take a big picture and be guided with some things that, some questions that will really help to them to become broader in their thinking about their students, who they are, what they can do versus what they can't do. Jen is commenting, she's taking away the examining bias is a strong tool for ensuring candidates are increasing their culturally responsive data literacy skills. I was involved in developing the Using Data toolkit and the Using Data approach to data use many years ago. And one of the first things that hit us when we started working with teachers is that looking at data was very a dangerous activity for suddenly raising many, many stereotypes and many, many biases. And we had to step back and think really carefully about how you integrate equity and equitable practices with data, and it's so key and critical. So we are running close to our time, so let's thank you for these comments, and we'll move to the next. Ellen? Ellen?
Sorry, on mute. Thank you all for your thoughtful comments. Really, really important and insightful. So let me bring you back to the matrix again and rethink that. Given now what you know, what you've learned about both concepts, having gone through the scenario, how do you feel about the ability to hit this or this? Do you think that this quadrant is still the aspiration and whether this is possible? Continue to think about that. Write in your comments. But as we move forward, now becomes the really tough work for you all. Hopefully you've had some insight and fun in doing the scenario, just as Saroja and I did. But let's move you now to the question that we've been playing with for a long time. What role can educator preparation programs play in the ability to integrate both data literacy and culturally responsive practice into your landscape? We already know from what you've said that few are on the data literacy side and all of you are on the culturally responsive practice. Now we have this merged construct. It's central, and from my opinion and the work with my colleagues and others, what we found about data literacy, I won't speak for the culturally responsive practice, is that at the earliest stages of the career, educators should at least be made aware of and attend to issues around these concepts. You wouldn't expect an educator to graduate from college, go out and teach without their pedagogy, without their classroom management, without their content. Why should this be any different? So in introducing culturally responsive data literacy, the first place should be in teacher preparation. Have it serve as a foundation and have it reinforced through professional development and technical assistance throughout their careers. Opportunities to practice, hopefully to have a culture in their own schools that will support it through data teams and people who are aware of these concepts. So let us ask you to introspect about what you've heard today and asking yourself these questions. Does your institution have a common definition of data literacy, the skills, knowledge, dispositions that are in the first handout that you saw? Does your institution have a course on data literacy, but as we've already discussed, and I've commented about this in the chat some, is it really about assessment or is it about data? Broadly construed, that can serve as an asset model to address the whole child and bring to the table culturally responsive perspective. Where might this be embedded in your courses? We did a study at the 2016 CAPE conference where we gave a survey to all attendees, so about 1,500, 2,000 people. And what they said overwhelmingly with only one or two dissensions is that data literacy should be integrated. And if there's room in the curriculum, maybe a standalone course. The same may apply here because someone has already asked, where is it possible? Where do you suggest for integration? Then the question, and we'll generalize beyond data literacy, is are your faculty prepared to teach this, and what kind of professional learning might they need to be able to do that? The handouts about the questions that Saroja and I put together for you about a student's performance backgrounds, their cultural and contextual backgrounds, and about potential biases are some sorts of resources that might be used to help the faculty as well as using as a teaching tool in the courses. Further introspection, which I will turn now over to Saroja.
Thanks, Ellen. And so, oh, sorry, you already finished the slide. It's getting late in the day here on the East Coast, so I apologize. In relation to culturally responsive teaching practice, I mean, these questions are parallel to the questions that Ellen just posed, you know, and so as you're doing the program mapping, right, and you're using that tool and you're thinking about what your program is doing across courses and experiences to prepare candidates, you know, these are some really good questions to think about. One of the things I also wanted to flag for folks, since we didn't really look deeply at the guiding questions tool, that was handout number 5, is also thinking about, you know, culturally responsive teaching in relation to, and data literacy in relation to those 3 domains, right? And so in that guiding questions handout, you'll see the questions, right, are organized around these 3 domains. And these 3 domains really trigger us to think about, as we're preparing candidates or strengthening teachers, in-service teachers' practice, what's the work we're doing to help them not only understand their students and their students' experiences and their lives, but understand themselves, right, and to examine and interrogate their own biases. So I think about the role play, and I think about that conversation that Saroja and Ellen were having, and Saroja having that aha moment in the conversation, where I love how I'm talking about myself in third person, right? And where Saroja says, I never really thought about that. Like, I think I see a bias that I have about how I'm understanding my students. And that's a critical part of the work of preparing teachers and candidates to not just be culturally responsive, but to also be culturally responsive in their data literacy practices.
Okay, let me be very quick on this so that Susan can do the wrap-up. We have a second workshop planned, as I mentioned, sometime in late winter, early spring. We would like you to go think very deeply about what we presented today. Go back to your institution and talk to the appropriate staff members, whether they're faculty, directors, administrators, about what you've heard today. Think about what a syllabus might look like that would integrate culturally responsive data literacy. Then come back to the next workshop and help share what you've learned in your own institutions, how this might be done, how we might help to bring teacher candidates to the point that they are at least introduced to and have a modicum of culturally responsive data literacy before they exit your program and go into real practice. And we would also invite you to think about how we, as the regional lab, might help you in thinking about how to do this, how we might work with you, how we might pilot such resources and assistance. So with that, turn it over to Susan to wrap things up.
Thank you, Ellen, and thank you, Saroja, for your work on this, especially kind of coming together to put these 2 pieces of work together and to take the field a little further in our thinking about how we help both teacher candidates, but also teachers in service to think about using data in a more culturally responsive way. And thank you to all of you who joined us today. There are quite a few of you, and for your comments, and we will build on these the insights you provided, and also be in touch if you would like to be to prepare for the next session so that we can make sure that it is directly aligned to what you would most like to do and the actions you'd like to take. Your feedback is essential to our work, so please click on the link and take our survey. The link is also in the chat, so you may have already seen that, and it is right there at the, and you can just click on that link and take our survey. Also, we want, as I mentioned, because this is a two-part series, we would love to hear from you. What would you like to have more of, less of in the next session? What are your particular situations? So our contact information emails are right there in the slide deck, and we invite you to contact us in between. The references for our session, which are our references are very important because the regional lab operates all of its work out of a research base, so they are included right in your slide deck. But if there are other resources you would like to have access to, please let us know, and we would be happy to help you with that. So with that, I would like to thank you all for your attention, your participation, and your conversations in the chat. We hope this information has been useful and provoke some thinking about how we can move some attention toward curriculum-responsive data literacy forward in these next few months as we begin to work together on these ideas. Thank you very much.